The silence in Prince Elian's chambers was a manufactured thing, as pristine and lifeless as the spun glass blossoms arranged in a vase on the obsidian table. It was not the absence of sound, but the suppression of it, a thick, velvet weight pressed down upon the world. The air, scrubbed clean by filtration units hidden within the walls, carried only the faintest, most antiseptic ghost of lavender, a scent chosen for its calming properties, its utter lack of personality. Elian smoothed a hand down the front of his ceremonial robes, the silk impossibly cold against his skin, its texture a slick, frictionless whisper. He was a portrait of placid grace, a study in serene compliance. It was a lie he had perfected over 19 years, a mask sculpted from duty and expectation. Outside the reinforced window, the capital city of Eridor sprawled beneath a dome of perpetual, synthesized twilight, its geometric perfection a testament to the crown's unyielding control. There were no messy sunrises here, no unpredictable weather. There was only order. In the corner of the room, a statue given breath. Sir Kaelin of the Onyx Guard stood motionless, his presence a dark, solid punctuation to the room's pale elegance. Clad in the matte black armor of his station, he was less a man and more a symbol of the king's authority. His helmet was off, tucked under one arm in the formal at-ease posture, but his face was a helmet of its own, all sharp angles and disciplined stillness. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, seeing nothing and everything. He was Elian's shadow, his protector, his jailer. For 3 years, since Elian's formal presentation as the realm's most prized Omega, Kaelin had been a constant, silent fixture in his life. He was the most decorated alpha in the Guard, a living legend whose control over his own instincts was said to be absolute. He never spoke unless addressed. He never moved unless protocol demanded it. He simply was, a wall of muscle and metal and unwavering loyalty. Elian's gaze drifted to the mirror. The reflection that met him was a stranger's, a beautiful, hollow doll with his own pale hair and violet eyes. His Omega phenotype, the genetic lottery ticket that had defined his entire existence, was both a blessing and a curse. It had swaddled him in luxury, but it had also placed him in this gilded cage, his every breath monitored, his every hormonal fluctuation managed by a precise regimen of suppressants. The drugs kept his heats at bay, muted his scent to a barely there whisper of rain-washed petals, and flattened his emotional landscape into a manageable, placid plateau. They made him safe. They made him controllable. They made him a perfect political asset. Today, that value would be formally appraised. The emissary from the northern duchies was arriving to finalize the terms of his betrothal to Duke Valerius, a man twice his age known for his cruelty and his iron-fisted rule. A strategic alliance, a necessary sacrifice. The words echoed in Elian's mind, the hollow platitudes his father, the king, had offered him. A soft chime resonated through the room, signaling the summons. It was time. Elian took a slow, measured breath, the conditioned air feeling thin and useless in his lungs. He rose, the silk of his robes pooling around his feet like liquid moonlight. As he turned, he misjudged the distance, his path taking him a fraction closer to Kaelin than he'd intended. The sleeve of his robe, impossibly fine, brushed against the exposed skin of Kaelin's wrist, where the heavy gauntlet ended. It was nothing, a flicker of contact, lighter than a moth's wing. But a jolt, stark and electric, shot up Elian's arm. It was not static. It was something else, something alive and feral that ripped through the placid fog of his suppressants. For a single, shattering second, the sterile air was split by a scent so powerful it made him dizzy. Pine needles after a frost, cold, clean stone, the deep, resonant scent of a winter forest. It was an alpha scent, raw and unfiltered, and it called to a part of him he didn't know existed. His breath hitched, his eyes, wide with shock, flew to Kalen's face. The statue had cracked. Kalen's jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. His storm-grey eyes were fixed on Ilion, no longer vacant, but blazing with a sudden, terrifying intensity. The air between them thrummed, a live wire of sensation. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. Kalen's expression shuttered. The scent vanished, smothered back into non-existence. The air was once again sterile, silent, controlled, but the memory of it burned in Elion's senses, a phantom limb of feeling. He was not an asset. The thought came, unbidden and sharp. He was not a portrait. He was a person, and for the first time, in the presence of this silent night, he had felt terrifyingly, undeniably real. He straightened his shoulders, the mask of the serene prince sliding back into place, but his heart hammered against his ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage of bone, awakened by a storm it had never known was coming. Sir Kalen stood rooted to the polished marble floor, his entire being a monument to control. Discipline was the bedrock of his existence, the forge in which his will had been tempered into something harder than steel. He was a knight of the Onyx Guard, the personal shield of the crown, and his body was not his own. It was an instrument, a weapon sworn to King Theron. He catalogued the world in threats and assets, in angles of attack and lines of sight. The prince, Elion, was the most precious asset in the kingdom, a delicate, beautiful piece of statecraft whose security was Kalen's singular purpose. He observed the prince's life as a series of routines, the morning instruction, the afternoon walk in the sanitized gardens, the evening readings. He was a constant, unobtrusive presence, his senses always alert, his instincts always suppressed. The primal nature of his alpha phenotype was a beast he kept chained in the deepest dungeon of his mind, starved and silent. But the touch had been a breach, a catastrophic failure. The whisper of silk against his skin had been like a lit match to a fuse, a jolt of bioelectricity, fierce and unsanctioned, had arced between them. For one unforgivable moment, the beast had roared. The scent he had guarded so ferociously, the core of his alpha signature, the scent of his soul, as the old poets called it, had torn through his control. Pine and winter stone. It was a scent of wild, untamed places, a scent that had no business existing within the sterile confines of the palace, and in return he had been assaulted by a scent that should not have been possible. Through the thick chemical veil of the prince's suppressants, a fragrance had bloomed in the air, vivid and overwhelming. Crushed jasmine petals after a summer downpour. The sweet, clean scent of damp earth. It was the true scent of the Omega, pure and achingly vulnerable, and it had slammed into Kalen's senses with the force of a physical blow. It was a homing beacon, a key turning in a lock he hadn't known he possessed. His body had reacted before his mind could. A possessive growl had rumbled in his chest, a sound he had ruthlessly silenced. His muscles had coiled, ready to close the distance, to shield, to claim. It was the most profound loss of control he had experienced since his brutal academy training. He had wrestled the beast back into its cage, slamming the iron door shut, but the phantom scent lingered. Jasmine and rain. It clung to the inside of his mind, a ghost of sensation that made his teeth ache. He forced his gaze away from the prince, focusing on the intricate scrollwork of the far wall, his mind a litany of protocols. Asset is secure. Perimeter is stable. Threat level is 0. But there was a threat. The threat was inside him. He could feel his own heart, a slow, heavy drum against the rigid shell of his armor. It was a traitorous rhythm. A memory, fractured and searing, flashed behind his eyes. Fire, the smell of burning wood, and the taste of ash. A younger, terrified version of himself, cornered and bleeding. Then a figure in black armor, the king himself, cutting down their enemies with cold, precise fury. King Theron had plucked him from the ashes of a border skirmish that had claimed his family, had seen the raw potential in the feral, grieving alpha boy. He had given him a purpose, a code, an identity. Loyalty is the only honor that matters, the king had told him, his voice as cold and clear as ice. Your strength is a tool for the stability of this kingdom. Control it, or it will be taken from you. His oath was not just words. It was a blood debt. He owed the king his life, his allegiance, his very will. The prince was the king's son, the king's property, an object of strategic importance. Kaelin was the shield that protected that object. He was not permitted to feel. He was not permitted to want. He was a function, not a man. He tightened his grip on his helmet, the cold metal, a familiar grounding pain against his knuckles. He would double his vigilance. He would reinforce his control. This weakness, this momentary, shameful lapse, would be scoured from his being. He would not fail his king. He would not. But as he followed the prince from the chamber, the ghost of Jasmine and Rain trailed after him, a silent, damning accusation. The throne room was an exercise in calculated intimidation. Vast and cold, its ceilings soared into shadow, supported by pillars of black obsidian that seemed to drink the light. At the far end, upon a dais of tiered grey stone, sat King Theron. He was not a large man, but his presence filled the cavernous space, his stillness more commanding than any gesture. Beside him, a chair remained empty, a memorial to the late queen. Before the dais stood the emissary from the northern duchies, a gaunt man named Lord Vorlag, whose thin lips were permanently curved in a slight reptilian smile. Ellion stood beside his father's throne, a silent, decorative figure in the unfolding transaction. He felt less like a prince and more like a prized mare being presented for sale. Lord Vorlag's eyes, small and dark, roamed over him with a proprietary air that made Ellion's skin crawl. The man spoke of trade routes and mineral rights, his voice a dry rustle, but his gaze spoke of other, more personal acquisitions. He was assessing the quality of the merchandise. The Duke Valerius is most pleased with the alliance, Vorlag was saying, his smile widening fractionally. He is eager to welcome the prince into his household. He believes a fertile Omega will bring stability, and of course a much-needed heir to his line. The words were clinical, brutal. Fertile Omega. Heir. Ellion felt a wave of nausea, cold and sharp. The room seemed to tilt, the filtered air growing thick and suffocating. A familiar panic began to prickle at the edges of his consciousness, the precursor to a suppressant failure. His carefully constructed composure was fracturing. His breath became shallow, his hands, hidden in the long sleeves of his robe, grew clammy. He could feel the delicate chemical balance within him beginning to tip, a cascade of hormonal signals threatening to break free. It was the terror of losing control, of his body betraying him in this cold, hostile space. His gaze, desperate for an anchor, darted instinctively toward the corner of the room where Kaelin stood. The knight was in his customary position, a pillar of silent obedience near the grand entrance. But as Elian's panic crested, something impossible happened. He saw it. Through the 50 feet of cold marble that separated them, he saw the shift. Kaelin's shoulders, already broad, seemed to tighten. His head lifted a fraction of an inch. His grey eyes, which should have been fixed forward, were locked directly on Lord Vorlag. The look in them was not the dispassionate vigilance of a guard. It was something ancient and lethal, a flicker of pure, undiluted alpha fury, a predator's warning to a rival who had strayed too close to his territory. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by the same disciplined emptiness as before, but Elian had seen it. And more than that, he had felt it, as if a warm, protective current had flowed from the night across the cold room and wrapped around him. The invisible touch was a grounding force against the rising tide of his panic. The frantic hammering in his chest slowed. The air cleared in his lungs. The warmth was a shield, a silent declaration. You are not alone. Elian dragged his eyes away, his heart performing a slow, heavy roll in his chest. He looked at his father. King Theron's face was, as always, an unreadable mask of placid authority. But his eyes, for a split second, flickered from Lord Vorlag to Elian and then to Sir Kaelin. A flicker of cold, calculating assessment. A scientist observing the interaction of chemicals. There was no surprise in the king's gaze, only confirmation. A chill, far colder than his own panic, settled deep in Elian's bones. This was not a secret. This connection, this strange, terrifying resonance between himself and his guard, was not a secret at all. It was a known variable in the king's grand equation. Elian straightened his spine, the warmth from Kaelin still a phantom presence around his shoulders. He was no longer just a pawn. He was a pawn on a board where one of the other pieces had suddenly, inexplicably, sworn its allegiance to him. The game had changed, and for the first time, Elian felt a sliver of a dangerous, unfamiliar desire. The desire to play. The moment the emissary had departed and the prince was returned to his gilded cage, Kaelin sought an audience with the king. He stood at attention in the king's private study, a chamber far smaller than the throne room, but infinitely more oppressive. Books bound in dark leather lined the walls, their spines uniform and severe. The air smelled of old paper and the metallic tang of absolute power. King Theron sat behind a desk of petrified wood, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He did not invite Kaelin to be at ease. "Report," the king said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "My king," Kaelin began, his own voice a low, formal baritone. "I request immediate reassignment from the prince's personal detail." He kept his explanation brief, clinical, devoid of emotion. "I believe my phenotype is creating an unacceptable atmospheric disturbance. A more neutrally compatible guard would better serve the prince's needs and ensure his continued stability." He did not mention the scent, the touch, the searing look he had given Lord Vorlag. To do so would be to admit a catastrophic failure of his core directive: control. He was offering a sanitized version of the truth, a piece of technical jargon to mask a deeply personal and dangerous reality. The king was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on Kaelin, analytical and unnervingly perceptive. He looked, Kaelin thought, like a man examining a complex piece of machinery for a flaw. An atmospheric disturbance, the king repeated, the words dripping with faint, cold irony. You, Sir Kaelin, the alpha whose self-mastery is the standard by which all other knights are judged, the one who walked through the nesting dens of the Red Peaks during the uprising without so much as a flicker of instinct. You are telling me my own son's presence is too much for you to handle. The question was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a tightening of the leash. My control is not in question, Your Majesty, Kaelin stated, the words tasting like ash. It was a lie, and they both knew it. It is a matter of optimal function, a precaution. The king unsteepled his fingers and leaned forward, his gaze hardening into something sharp and precise. Your control is precisely why you are there, Sir Kaelin. I did not place a random alpha at my son's side. I placed you. Your legendary discipline was the key variable. The proximity to a high-value Omega, particularly one as potent as Elion, is the ultimate test. A crucible. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. Your control is your greatest asset. Do not disappoint me. He leaned back, a silent dismissal. Your request is denied. Kaelin's blood ran cold. A crucible. The words echoed in his mind, stripping away his last illusion of agency. He was not a shield. He was a lab rat. The king had known this might happen. He had anticipated it. He had engineered it. He had placed Kaelin in a position of impossible temptation, not to protect his son, but to observe the outcome. To what end? To test the limits of alpha discipline, to gauge the strength of a primal bond against a lifetime of conditioning. The king's motives were as opaque and complex as the mechanisms of a chronometer, but his methods were terrifyingly clear. He was using them both. Kaelin bowed his head, the polished floor reflecting his own grim, trapped expression. Yes, Your Majesty. The words were torn from him, a concession of absolute defeat. He turned and walked from the room, each step heavy with the chains he had only just now realized he was wearing. He was trapped, forced to remain at Elion's side, where every breath was a temptation, every glance a transgression. The proximity was no longer a duty. It was a sentence, a slow, exquisite form of torture designed by the very man he had sworn his life to obey. The beast in his dungeon rattled its chains, and this time it sounded less like a roar and more like a promise. A new, restless energy hummed beneath Elion's skin. The encounter in the throne room, Kaelin's silent defense, and his father's cold, knowing gaze had irrevocably altered the landscape of his existence. The placid surface of his life had been shattered, and he found he had no desire to piece it back together. His obedience had been a survival mechanism, a way to navigate the treacherous currents of the court. But now, defiance felt like breathing. He began to push, in small, subtle ways, against the invisible walls of his cage. He started refusing his evening sedative, claiming it gave him nightmares. He altered the route of his prescribed walks, veering from the pristine, manicured lawns to the crumbling, forgotten peripheries of the palace grounds. It was on one of these unsanctioned explorations that he found it. A small, wrought iron gate, rusted and choked with ivy, half hidden behind a crumbling section of the outer wall. Pushing it open with a groan of disused metal, he stepped through and found himself in another world. It was a garden, but unlike any he had ever seen. This was not a place of geometric flower beds and scentless, hybridized blossoms. This was a riot of life, untamed and beautifully chaotic. Wild roses climbed the stone walls, their scent heavy and sweet. Night-blooming jasmine, its fragrance a heady, intoxicating perfume, hung thick in the cool evening air. Patches of mint and lavender grew in fragrant tangles, and the ground was soft with moss and damp earth. It was a place of real smells, of life and decay, of messy, uncontrolled beauty. It was a sanctuary. Elian came back the next night, and the night after that. He would sit on a crumbling stone bench, the moon filtering through the overgrown branches, and simply breathe. He would take off the scented gloves he was required to wear, running his bare hands over the rough bark of a tree, the soft petals of a flower, the cool, damp moss. Here, he was not a prince, not an Omega, not an asset. He was just Elian. One night, as he sat listening to the chirp of crickets, a sound so alien and wonderful to his palace-attuned ears, he felt a familiar shift in the atmosphere, the solid, silent presence. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew Kalen was there. He had followed him. But he was not standing at a rigid, prescribed distance. He was leaning against the ancient stone archway of the gate, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, his posture relaxed for the first time Elian had ever seen. He wasn't there to reprimand him or escort him back. He was simply watching over him. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the sterile vacuum of the palace. It was a shared, breathing quiet, filled with the sounds of the night and the scent of jasmine. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Elian said, his voice soft, not wanting to break the spell. He didn't look at Kalen, but he felt the night's gaze on him. A long pause, then a low voice from the shadows, rough with disuse. "It is wild." The word hung in the air. Wild. It was a condemnation in the king's court, a synonym for uncontrolled, for dangerous. But in Kalen's voice, it sounded like a form of reverence. "They tried to tame it," Elian mused, tracing the vein of a leaf with his fingertip. "My grandmother, the queen, loved this garden. After she died, my father had it sealed. He said nature was inefficient, prone to chaos." He finally turned to look at the night, a direct challenge in his violet eyes. "Why do you serve him, Sir Kalen, a man who fears a garden?" Kalen's silhouette remained perfectly still. The moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the grim set of his mouth. Elian expected a deflection, a platitude about duty or honor. Instead, he got another silence. But this one was different. It was heavy, not with discipline, but with a deep, crushing weight of unspoken history. The knight's gaze dropped to the ground, and in that simple gesture, Elian saw a universe of pain. He saw the crack in the armor, the man suffocating beneath the legend. He had asked a question, and Kalen had answered it with his whole being. In the secret, wild garden, under the silent watch of the moon, the prince and his knight were no longer their designated roles. They were just a man who was trapped and a man who was guarding the cage, both beginning to realize the bars were on the inside. The garden became their unspoken cathedral. The nightly ritual of quiet communion, the shared air thick with the scent of real life, began to erode the foundations of Kalen's conditioning. The prince's question, "Why do you serve him?" had lodged in his mind like a shard of obsidian, working its way deeper with every passing day. His loyalty to the king had been the north star of his existence, a fixed point of unwavering certainty. Now, it felt like a sickness. The memories he had polished into a narrative of rescue and gratitude began to show their tarnish, the details shifting into sharper, uglier focus. He started to remember things he had long since suppressed, the truth bubbling up from the poisoned well of his past. He was standing guard outside the prince's chambers, the palace corridors silent and sterile, when a more vivid memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not just fire. It was the specific, acrid smell of a state-sanctioned incendiary compound. It was not a border skirmish. It was his family's small, rural estate. His parents were not casualties of war. They were academics, writers, their crime a series of published essays that gently questioned the Crown's policy of phenotype suppression and arranged pairings, arguing for a more natural, chaotic order. They were labeled dissidents. He remembered his father, a gentle beta scholar, standing before the black armored soldiers, not with a weapon, but with a book in his hand. He remembered his mother, an alpha herself, shielding him, her scent, normally of old parchment and chamomile, spiking with fear and defiance. Then, the king, not as a savior descending from the heavens, but as the cold arbiter of their fate. He remembered King Theron watching, his expression dispassionate as the commander gave the order. He remembered the screams. He remembered being dragged away, fighting and snarling, a feral 10-year-old alpha. The king had approached him later in a sterile white room after the fire, and the screaming had stopped. "Your parents were flawed," the king had said, his voice devoid of pity. "Their sentimentality was a weakness, a contagion. But you have strength, a fire that can be forged, not just left to burn. I am saving you from their weakness. Swear your life and your will to me, and I will give you a purpose that matters. I will make you honorable." It wasn't a rescue. It was an acquisition. The king hadn't saved him, he had harvested him. He had murdered his family and claimed their son as spoils, a promising specimen to be broken and remade in his own image. His entire life, his code, his legendary control, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed cage of gratitude built around a core of profound trauma. He was not a knight. He was a product. He was not an asset. He was an experiment. The realization crashed over him, a cold, sickening wave. He looked down at his own hands, at the black gauntlets that represented his honor. They felt like shackles. His unwavering loyalty was not a virtue. It was the result of the most profound and patient act of psychological warfare. He thought of Elian, so beautiful and vibrant, being prepared for his own slow execution, being sold to a brute for stability. He saw his mother's defiant face, his father's gentle plea. They were the same. Elian, his parents, they were all just chaotic variables to be controlled or eliminated by the king's cold, relentless calculus. A low growl, the first he had allowed to surface in years, vibrated in his chest. It was the sound of a chain snapping. His loyalty to the crown was dead, incinerated in the fire of a truth he could no longer deny. Now, a new loyalty was taking root, something fierce and primal and utterly his own. It was a loyalty to the boy with violet eyes and the scent of summer rain, the other beautiful, captive thing the king sought to break. The delicate balance Elian had maintained for years was gone, shattered by the burgeoning connection with Kaelin and the stark terror of his impending marriage. The stress, the emotional turmoil, the secret defiance, it was all too much for the suppressants to contain. It began as a subtle fever, a tremor deep within him that the palace med scanners dismissed as a minor anomaly. But Elian knew. He felt the chemical walls crumbling, the tide of his own biology rising, fierce and inexorable. He was in the scriptorium, ostensibly studying trade agreements, when the first real wave hit. A dizzying heat bloomed in his chest and spread through his limbs, making the air feel thick as honey. His own scent, the one he hadn't truly smelled in years, flooded his senses, no longer just rain-washed petals, but something deeper, sweeter, a desperate, aching summons. Jasmine and damp earth amplified 1,000 times. Panic seized him. A heat, here now, was a disaster. It was a biological failing that would see him sedated, isolated, and treated like a malfunctioning machine until it passed. Kalen, standing guard by the door, went rigid. Even from across the room, Elian could feel the change. The air crackled. The knight's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. His alpha instincts, already strained to their breaking point, were being assaulted by the pure, unfiltered scent of an Omega in distress. Elian met his eyes, and the plea was clear, a silent scream for help. Before the first attendant could even register the change in the room's atmosphere, Kalen moved. It was not the precise, measured movement of a guard. It was the explosive, fluid grace of a predator. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his expression a mask of ferocious determination. He reached Elian just as the prince's knees buckled, or catching him easily. "The prince is unwell," Kalen announced, his voice a low, commanding thunder that tolerated no argument. "He requires immediate seclusion in his chambers. Alert the royal physicians. No one else is to approach." He swept Elian into his arms. The contact was explosive. The cold metal of Kalen's armor against Elian's feverish skin was a shock, but beneath it, Elian could feel the radiating warmth of the man himself. And the scent. My God, the scent. Kalen's control was gone, his own primal signature pouring off him in waves, pine and frost and cold stone, a powerful grounding anchor in the storm of Elian's heat. He buried his face in the crook of Kalen's neck, inhaling the scent that was both a balm and a fire. Kalen carried him through the corridors, his pace swift and unwavering, his presence a clear and present danger to anyone who might try to interfere. He reached Elian's chambers, dismissing the frantic attendants with a single glacial look. He carried Elian inside, kicked the door shut, and engaged the heavy magnetic lock. A deep, resonant thud echoed through the room. They were sealed in. The room was immediately filled with their combined scents, a swirling vortex of alpha and omega pheromones, so thick it was almost visible. The beast was loose in Kalen. His instincts screamed at him, a chorus of primal commands: claim, mate, breed. His body was rigid with the effort of restraint, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Elian, lost in the haze of his heat, whimpered, his body arching with need. But Kalen did not move toward the bed. He fought himself, fought the billion years of biology that demanded he take what was being so freely offered. He knelt before Elian, who had sunk to the floor, and placed a hand not on his skin, but on his shoulder, the metal of the gauntlet a deliberate barrier. "Elian," he said, his voice strained, raw, "look at me. Breathe with me." He held the prince's terrified gaze, pouring all of his will, all of his newly claimed devotion, into that look. He was not here to take. He was here to shield. He would be the rock that the storm broke against. It was an agony, a self-immolation of instinct. But it was also the first truly honorable act of his life. In that room, amidst the maelstrom of primal need, they were not Alpha and Omega. They were Kalen and Elian. And as Elian's panicked sobs slowly subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths that matched the night's own, a bond was forged between them, stronger than steel, more sacred than any vow. It was a bond of absolute trust, a quiet rebellion enacted in the very heart of the machine. King Theron sat in his silent study, observing the three-dimensional schematic of the palace displayed on his desk. A single suite of rooms glowed a soft, insistent red. The prince's chambers. The data streams scrolled at the side of the display. Atmospheric particulates, pheromone concentrations, biosignatures, audio logs, all of it painting a precise, clinical picture of the chaos unfolding within those walls. The Omega's heat cycle had initiated 17.3 minutes ahead of the most aggressive projections. The Alpha Knight's suppressant regimen had failed completely. Pheromonal compatibility was rated at 98.7%, a near-perfect biological match. The king watched the data, his expression as placid as a frozen lake. There was no anger, no frustration. There was only the detached curiosity of a scientist whose experiment had yielded an unexpected yet fascinating result. He had orchestrated this. He had seen the latent potential for a bond in their genetic profiles years ago, a statistical anomaly, a whisper of the ancient primal connections his orderly society had worked so hard to eradicate. Placing Kalen, his most controlled alpha, with Elian, his most potent omega, had been a calculated risk, a fascinating test case. Could a lifetime of conditioning and loyalty triumph over the base imperatives of biology? The answer, it seemed, was no. A lesser man would have been furious at Kalen's insubordination, at the catastrophic breach of protocol, but Theron did not deal in such inefficient emotions. Anger was a tool for motivating lesser men. For him, there was only data, and the data was clear. The assets were compromised. Sir Kalen was no longer a symbol of control. He was a vector of chaos. Prince Elian was no longer a viable political bargaining chip. He was the epicenter of a biological event that threatened stability. They had become liabilities. With a flick of his finger, the king closed the data stream. The experiment was concluded. Now, it was time to sterilize the laboratory. He activated his private comms link, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the gravity of the situation. "Commander Valerius," he said, addressing the head of the Onyx Guard, Kalen's own superior. "There has been an incident regarding the prince's security detail." He paused, allowing the commander to process the implications. "The alliance with Duke Valerius is paramount. The wedding is to be moved up immediately. Prepare the prince for secure transport to the northern duchies within the hour. He is to be sedated and handled by a beta-only team." "And the night, Your Majesty." The commander's voice crackled back, laced with grim understanding. King Theron gazed at the schematic, at the red square that pulsed like a failing heart. "Sir Kalen has been compromised. His conditioning has failed. He is a threat to the stability of the crown." He chose his next words with the precision of a surgeon. "Neutralize the asset, discreetly. I want it handled internally. No fanfare, no martyrs. It will be done, my king." The comms link went dead. The king leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing softly. He felt a flicker of something that might have been disappointment. Kalen had been his finest creation, a testament to the power of will over nature. But in the end, nature had won. It was an untidy, inefficient outcome. He brought up a new file on his display. Potential Omega candidates from the lesser noble houses. The system required balance. A replacement asset would be found. The machine would continue to run. The red light on the palace schematic was simply a flaw to be corrected, a variable to be erased from the equation. The storm had passed. In the aftermath, a fragile peace settled over the room. Elian was curled on a sofa, wrapped in a thick blanket, his body exhausted, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. The fever of the heat had broken, leaving behind a profound sense of connection, a low, steady hum that resonated between him and the night. Kalen sat in a chair opposite, his armor discarded on the floor in a heap of black metal. In the simple tunic and trousers beneath, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more human. He was watching Elian, his grey eyes no longer stormy or vacant, but filled with a quiet, fierce tenderness that made Elian's heart ache. They had not spoken for nearly an hour, but they had said everything. The silence was a conversation, a vow. It was a sharp, metallic clang at the door that broke the spell, the sound of the magnetic lock being overridden from the outside. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, his body a fluid shield between Elian and the door. He didn't need to look. He knew. It was the Onyx Guard, his brothers. "They know," Kalen said, his voice a low, grim rumble. "The king knows. He's not coming to negotiate." He glanced around the luxurious prison, his eyes sharp and analytical, no longer a guard's, but a fugitive's. "He'll send me to the sanitariums. He'll send you to the Duke. This is our only chance." Elian's blood ran cold, but the panic that would have once paralyzed him was replaced by a surge of cold, clear defiance. "The passages," he whispered, his mind racing. His small acts of rebellion, his explorations of the palace's forgotten corners, were suddenly no longer childish games. They were a map. "My grandmother," she showed me. Behind the tapestry in the west alcove, a service corridor for the old palace. It leads down to the geothermal vents. Kalen looked at him, a flicker of surprise and profound respect in his eyes. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture. "Get dressed. Something warm. Something you can run in." As Elian scrambled to pull on riding breeches and a dark tunic, Kalen moved to the door. He could hear the quiet, efficient sounds of his former comrades preparing to breach. He knew their tactics, their formations. He had written the manual. He picked up a single piece of his discarded armor, a heavy gauntlet. It was all the weapon he needed. The door hissed open. Two of his former squad members, faces grim behind their obsidian helmets, stepped in. "Sir Kalen," the lead one said, his voice flat with duty. "By order of the king, you are to stand down." "I no longer recognize his orders," Kalen replied, his voice dangerously soft. The moment they moved, he struck. He was not the disciplined knight they knew. He was an alpha fighting for his mate, a storm of controlled violence. He moved through them, not with lethal force, but with brutal efficiency. A shattered elbow here, a dislocated shoulder there. It was a tragic, intimate dance of violence, every move an apology and a declaration. He was not fighting monsters, he was fighting men he had bled with, men as trapped as he had been. "Now," he roared to Elian. Elian didn't hesitate. He tore the heavy tapestry from the wall, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A rush of cool, damp air smelling of stone and earth met them. As Kalen fought off a third guard in the doorway, Elian slipped into the darkness. Kalen disarmed the last man with a final, decisive blow, and plunged into the passage after him, pulling a heavy stone slab into place behind them. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the sounds of the palace silenced. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the frantic beat of their own hearts. Elian fumbled for Kaelin's hand, his fingers finding the warm, solid reassurance of his. His supposed weakness, his curiosity and defiance had become their salvation. Kaelin's strength, once a tool of the system, was now the weapon of their liberation. Hand in hand they ran, two broken pieces of the king's machine fleeing through the dark, forgotten veins of the very monster that had created them, running not just from death, but towards a life they had only just begun to imagine. The darkness of the service tunnels was absolute, a thick, palpable black that swallowed all light and sound. It smelled of damp stone, mineral deposits, and 1,000 years of forgotten history. For Elian, who had lived his life in the perpetual sterile twilight of the palace, it should have been terrifying. Instead, it was liberating. The oppressive weight of observation was gone. Here, in the belly of the beast, they were invisible. His hand was clenched tightly in Kaelin's, the rough warmth of the night's palm a grounding anchor in the disorienting dark. He was their guide now, his mind a feverish map of the passages his grandmother had shown him as a child, stories of secret escapes and hidden games that had become their only lifeline. "This way," he breathed, his voice a ghost in the immense silence. "There's a junction ahead. We need the left fork. It slopes down toward the old geothermal conduits." Kaelin moved behind him, a silent, powerful presence. He had shed the skin of the onyx guard, but the instincts of a protector remained, sharper and more focused than ever. Every drip of water, every skittering stone was registered and assessed. His senses, no longer suppressed, were a razor's edge, attuned to the slightest hint of pursuit. He could feel the vibrations through the stone floor, the subtle shifts in air pressure. He could smell the fear and adrenaline coming off Elian, a sharp, metallic tang beneath the sweet scent of jasmine that was now an indelible part of him. It was a scent he would die to protect. The fight with his brothers in arms had left a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He had seen their eyes behind their helmets, not with hatred, but with a grim, sorrowful duty. They were cogs in the same machine, and he pitied them. But that pity was a luxury he could not afford. His world had contracted to a single point of focus, the slender figure leading him through the darkness. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest. The air grew warmer, humid, thick with the smell of sulfur and steam. They could hear a low, distant roar, the sound of the earth's own heart. "The conduits," Elian gasped, leaning against a slick, wet wall to catch his breath. They vent to the surface, miles beyond the city wall, in the unclaimed wilds. They emerged into a vast, cavernous space, dimly lit by the faint, eerie red glow of the geothermal pipes that crisscrossed the ceiling like the veins of a titan. Steam hissed from ancient, corroded joints, shrouding the cavern in a shifting, ghostly fog. The roar was deafening here, a constant, overwhelming vibration that shook the very rock beneath their feet. In the center of the cavern, a massive, grated opening led upwards into pure blackness. A torrent of hot air and steam rushed from it. "That's it," Elian shouted over the din. "It's a steep climb. The service ladder is old." As they approached the vent, a sound cut through the roar, the sharp, unmistakable clang of armor on stone echoing from the tunnel they had just exited. They were being followed. A squad of Onyx guards, moving with silent, deadly purpose, emerged from the tunnel entrance, their black armor seeming to absorb the faint red light. They did not raise their weapons. They simply advanced, a wall of inexorable duty. Kalen pushed Elian behind him. "Go," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Climb. Do not stop. Do not look back." "Kalen, no," Elian cried, his hand grabbing Kalen's arm. "I won't leave you." Kalen turned, and for a moment his face softened. He cupped Elian's cheek, his calloused thumb stroking his skin. It was the first truly tender gesture that had ever passed between them. "My entire life has been a lie, Elian," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Serving a man I should have hated. My honor was a cage, protecting you, choosing you. This is the first true thing I have ever done. Now go, live, be free. That is my honor now." He pressed a hard, desperate kiss to Elian's forehead, a seal and a promise. Then he turned to face the advancing guards, his body settling into a wide, unbreakable stance. He was one man against 10, unarmed, in a cavern of steam and shadows. But he was no longer Sir Kalen of the Onyx Guard. He was Elian's alpha, and he would not be moved. As Elian, tears streaming down his face, began the terrifying climb up the rusted ladder into the darkness, the sounds of a brutal, desperate battle began below, a symphony of breaking bones and shattered duty, a final defiant roar against the dying of the light.